call the meeting to order. 8:15.
Just asking the freaking question.
Roll call. Ms. Van Bergen.
Here.
Mr. Scala.
Present.
Mr. Sager.
Here.
Mr. Thomas.
Here.
Mr. Kunkel. Here. Mr. Kaminsky.
Present.
All present. Counted for. The motion for the approval of the minutes. Mr. Kaminsky moves. Mr. Kunkel seconds. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, public comment.
Nobody.
Nobody. Member comments? Nobody. Okay, down to routine consent agenda. Are there any items?
510, please.
510.
Please.
You're welcome. Okay, is there a motion? Anybody else? Mr. Kaminsky moves to approve.
Yes.
All items 5-1 through 11 excluding 510. Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Kunkel seconds. Okay. Any questions on them at all? Okay. Then I'll proceed. Mr. Kaminsky.
Yes.
Mr. Kunkel.
Yes.
Mr. Thomas.
Yes.
Mr. Sager.
Yes.
Mr. Scala.
Yes.
Ms. Van Bergen.
Yes.
And I'll vote yes. And do I have a motion for item 510?
So moved.
Mr. Sager moves. Ms. Van Bergen seconds. Okay, Mr. Scala.
So in this agreement, it states that we have 60 days to approve the agreement. And my question revolves around the fact that we won't, as a county board, have that approved within the 60-day limit. So I am wondering, and I understand that, probably in the semantics of things that, it probably doesn't matter much, but I also know that AT&T can also come back and be like, well, you didn't give us a signed agreement in 60 days. So, and I know you put in a buffer of like $50,000 for, who knows what, but I don't need that to be sucked up by AT&T because we didn't get our contract into them within 60 days. So my question is it possible to have the committee give someone authorization to sign the agreement before the 60 days are up so that we don't have that potential issue?
I don't know if it's possible if somebody can beforehand.
Yes, we're going to have to. Mr. Kunkel?
Rather than us making a decision untoward or out of our lane, is it possible for someone here to make a request of them to extend this to a 90-day or a time certain when our board meeting is, their contract?
We can certainly ask. These are their standard forms for AT&T. They do it for everybody. This is the reimbursement side, which they do both in the private sector and the public sector. In my coordinations with Tristram, there hasn't been any issue with a 30-day, 60-day, 90-day on any of these. They want to make sure that something is executed and signed, and we look at it as the appropriation side to ensure that we have to have those funds available for the reimbursement of AT&T for this short section of that project. We can ask them and then bring a revised one either at MyCow or something like that and put it through the agenda.
Well, you can bring it to finance if you want. Can you have something by finance?
We can ask. It's AT&T there. They work sort of on their own time, but we can certainly ask them. We have it for FNA.
Okay. So my other question was, in relocating the utilities, I'm assuming there's going to be other agreements coming forward that with other utilities for?
At this point, no. We haven't had anybody else bring forward the documentation that they have easements in place that require the reimbursement. That's typically how these happen. The utility is outside of a right-of-way and they have superior easement through a subdivision plat typically. Then we acquire a right-of-way that overlaps that or needs them to move for some reason. Then the agency is required to compensate. If they're in the public right-of-way via permit, they relocate at their cost. So at this point, we've been budgeting and working with Scott to have monies available through the budget to pay for these relocations. To date, AT&T is the only one that's completed.
Okay.
You okay?
I'm fine. I was just going to say that I believe that these are pretty traditional, routine. I appreciate Mike's concern about, let's not get caught in a detail here in terms of timing, and I think that that's well considered, and it's a good thing to have the conversation, but I'm confident that we're going to be able to move this forward.
Oh, yeah, no.
I'll give you the last word if you want.
No, I want to move it forward, I just don't want to, have AT&T come back and be like, all right.
No, good point.
And to that point though, they have been given their permit. This is part of our permit process where we work with them on the relocations. They have the permit. The staff is actually, and their contractors are getting staged to do this work. This is a quote to say that we are going to reimburse them at the end of the project. This isn't pay them up front, which is why we put in a little of that buffer in the appropriation. Stuff happens in construction, and we wanted to be prepared for that. So we can ask AT&T, and if they say don't worry about it, we can bring that information to FNA and Kyle.
Okay. Any further questions? All right, then we'll proceed to a vote. Mr. Scala,
Yes.
Mr. Van Bergen,
Yes.
Mr. Kaminsky,
Yes.
Mr. Kunkel,
Yes.
Mr. Thomas,
Yes.
Mr. Sager.
Yes.
And I'll vote yes. It's been approved. Okay, new business. We're down to staff recognition.
All right, we have introduction, and Mr. Hennings will be introducing our newest team member. I won't steal his thunder.
All right. So, Hans Varga is our newest public information officer for McHenry County DOT. Born and raised in McHenry County, Hans has spent most of his life working and living in northern Illinois. He graduated from Marion Central Catholic High School and attended NIU, where he earned his bachelor's in communications. During this time, Hans also interned at the McHenry County DOT for multiple seasons in our maintenance section. After completing his undergrad, he began his graduate degree in adult and higher education at the same institution, working in the residence life department as a graduate assistant. He received an offer from George Williams College of Aurora University not long after beginning his master's program, and moved to Williams Bay, Wisconsin to lead the residence life program. When Aurora announced its closing, Hans took a different job at the Glenview Park District, where he's been the last 2 years. He's excited to be returning to the DOT in his new role as a public information officer. During his free time, you can find Hans working outdoors, exploring, woodworking, spending time with loved ones, and occasionally indulging in video games. So please help me welcome Hans to the DOT.
Follow up that great speech, so I was going to say all, but it's a pleasure to be working with you all. So.
Thanks, Hans.
Thanks, Hennings. Yes, he is.
Yes, everything about this dance now, it's titles.
Yes. For those of you that wondering, he is related. He is the son of Ernest Varga.
I can introduce this.
Now we need a good snowstorm to baptize that.
Okay. Okay, next one up, Mr. Sager will introduce Dr. Sager.
As everyone knows, there is a huge question right now with regards to the transit system in Northern Illinois and the financing and how we're going to approach it, and issues of governance have been raised as well by the legislature. And so very, very pleased to have with us today Rob Nash from RTA. Rob is going to kind of provide us with an update in terms of the latest information that came out from RTA with regards to potential cuts if in fact the legislature does not act in the financing or funding area, but also he's going to be telling us kind of where we are in terms of the legislative approach. He is always down at Springfield. In fact, I'm kind of surprised that at this time we pried him away from Springfield to get up here today because he's going to have a long way to go back home and a long way to get back to Springfield. But Rob, welcome to McHenry County. Welcome to the Department of Transportation here and to our committee meeting. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Schneider. I arrived home last night around 10:45, so I was in Springfield yesterday. We can talk about some of the latest discussions, but before we get into that, I thought we would quickly touch on our vision for the future, assuming that there is sufficient funding to implement some of the service improvements that we've all identified as goals and objectives that we share, and sort of talk a little bit about where we are in that legislative process, as Dr. Steiger mentioned. Please interrupt me with any questions that you might have at any moment. We have issued a series of reforms and what we would call sort of governance changes that we think are crucial to the future of the system. You might have seen some coverage of that over the last couple of months. It was introduced in August. But Transforming Transit, as we title this package of reforms, has really been the result of multiple years of engagement with organizations like the counties and COGS and communities across the region, with stakeholders from all walks of life that have sort of provided their input on this type of system they would like to see, and some of the improvements we'd like to implement in the governance of that system. We are at a critical point, as I think we all are aware. Some of the longstanding issues that the transit system has faced, including sort of underfunding from the state perspective, have sort of come to a head. The pandemic contributed to some of these issues, but certainly many of them have predated the actual impacts of the pandemic. I would just note one of the things that we talk a lot about is momentum, and we have a lot of positive momentum in the system. Ridership has continued to increase since the COVID low, double-digit increases each of the last 3 years, and we are expecting double-digit increases in the current year. So there's some momentum to capture here, and what we really don't want to do is sort of make the wrong choice as we hit that fork in the road. There's this choice that we are presented with between expanding the system, investing in the system, increasing frequency, which is really the primary objective of most of our riders as we talk to them, or sort of falling off what we call that fiscal cliff and facing some significant choices in terms of cuts and sort of constriction on the system. Many of those potential impacts were discussed last week in the media, as you might have seen. Our board is actually meeting tomorrow to formally consider some of the reports that we're going to get from the service boards on what they would be forced to do if funding doesn't materialize. And we'll go into it in a little bit more detail before I complete the presentation. But essentially, the long and short of it is we're facing a 20% budget gap, but in order to close that gap, absent additional funding, we would have to reduce service by about 40%. I can walk through why that math is the way it is, but essentially, operators of transit vehicles usually operate more than one route, and if you have to eliminate some of those operators, you have sort of cascading effects that impact more than one route. So it's really not a future that any of us want to confront, particularly in areas where we think service is already not sufficient for the demand that's out there. The other option, though, is to build on those double-digit ridership growth trends and plan for service improvements in the region that would boost access to the system for everyone, no matter where they live. Specifically, we believe that a $1.5 billion investment in funding or in the system will allow a strengthened RTA to oversee region-wide minimum service standards that cut customers' wait time by as much as 50%. We have heard consistently that frequency and reliability and safety, and we'll get into that, are really the number one issues when it comes to people's concerns about the system. More options over more hours of the day is really sort of the recipe for success here. Frequency, as we talk about it, is freedom for a lot of folks. If you don't have to worry about the schedule, where you know that it's frequent enough that you can plan around it, you're more likely to use the system. We also have said, though, that we know the status quo is not necessarily tenable. We agree, as the RTA, that reforms need to be implemented in the system along with investments in its operations. We have put forth a series of what we think are key reforms that will help boost accountability in the system and really concentrate responsibility into the RTA so that everyone understands who's responsible and accountable for delivering the service that everyone should expect across the region. Specifically, we've talked about three main areas that we think should be sort of centralized at the regional entity. The first is regional fare policy and rider communications, setting service standards so that everyone understands what is projected and committed to being delivered in every part of the region. And then a more integrated approach on capital project prioritization. And I can get into each of these in more detail, but essentially, these are the items that not only the RTA has identified, but other organizations, including CMAP and private entities, have said for a number of years, the way to improve the system is to concentrate some of these responsibilities at the regional level while maintaining the operational independence of the service boards and their governance structure, mainly because the system is very diverse. As you can imagine, operating a bus service in McHenry County is much different than the urban core, and that there are different expectations and requirements across the region. And so we still believe that the operating of the system should remain with the experts, which are located inside of PACE, Metro, and the CTA. In addition to those reforms, this is an image from a safety and security summit that we held last year. We understand that safety, security, cleanliness is a key objective for all of this. People will not get on the system if they don't believe it's safe. And while crime is continuing to trend down, in fact, crime data has been frankly very encouraging over the last 9 to 18 months. We understand the perception is reality for a lot of folks, and we are suggesting some robust approaches as it comes in terms of ambassadors, which are folks that are trained to sort of engage with riders to help navigate the system, but also identify challenges. And then frankly, law enforcement presence simply needs to be increased across the system. Beyond those reforms that would change how policy is administered in the region while maintaining the leadership of the service boards to provide service, we've also identified 2 tranches of sort of commitments on the system side that we think are important. We are not alone in facing a fiscal cliff across the nation. Transit systems of all types and sizes have had similar trajectories where there was impact coming out of COVID, and they've had to kind of rethink how they approach providing service. And most of those systems have put reforms and efficiencies on the table. We have also done that. And frankly, we've also put what we would term a future fare increase on the table once the system is improved and riders are seeing the value that they're getting for this additional investment. We think that sort of skin in the game is important. And as we talked about, centralizing fare setting policies, we just think the conversation, which is now reserved for the service boards to determine and not the RTA, needs to be had on a regular basis. Riders are an important component of the system, and we think they should be participating and supporting it. There's no scenario in which riders can get us out of this hole solely through fares. But we do think there's a responsibility of the system to make sure riders are making a reasonable contribution. One thing I'll note on the efficiencies, though, because it does get a lot of attention, the system as a whole, and each of the individual service boards, when compared to their peers, always scores in the top tier of efficiency. If you look at it per passenger per revenue mile, or revenue per passenger mile, the system consistently scores as one of the more efficient in the nation. And I just want to note one point of context, because I think my friends in Springfield sometimes lose this, but just in the last 10 years, so just from 2015, the state has removed more than $400 million in resources from the transit system. That's a combination of reduced public transportation fund matching dollars, it's reductions in appropriations for mandated services. I know that many in the municipal world are familiar with the Department of Revenue charging us a fee to collect sales taxes, so we give the state of Illinois $30 million a year, every year, just to give us our money back. And so this notion of imposing efficiencies in the system, 100% behind it, but I would just note, between this commitment and what the state has already done over the last 10 years, $500 million have come out of the system. And so there really has been an efficiency sort of imposed, and it's just an important context to remember as we talk about funding overall. As I mentioned, the RTA board is meeting tomorrow to receive sort of presentations from each of the service boards. About 60 days ago, the board asked CTA, Metro, and PACE to present some information, basically flesh out two scenarios and then one other objective. The first scenario is the cut scenario. What happens if we fall off the fiscal cliff? What happens to services across the region if we don't make additional investments in the system and we're forced to constrict? The second is, conversely, what happens if we have the funds to invest in the system? What types of service would improve and what could everyone expect as a result? And then finally, we kind of touched on the efficiencies, but there'll be a more robust discussion of actual items that can be implemented across each of the service boards to save some of those funds, to create efficiencies and better utilize the funds that we have. And so I'll briefly touch on some of these impacts. You might have seen some coverage last week. As I'm sure everyone in this room is aware, that oftentimes we are required to post materials prior to the board meeting. And so as we posted those, we just decided to present the details to the media, but there'll be a robust discussion tomorrow that Dr. Snyder will participate in at the board to talk about what these cuts could mean. But here's the headline: they're bad, they're not good. And I know that people have sort of maybe grown accustomed to agencies, crying poor or crying wolf, but I will tell you, I was able to participate in the last sort of discussion that the General Assembly conducted on funding in the region back in 2006 and 7 and really completed in 2008. And those cuts were going to be dramatic, but they were contained primarily to the CTA. This is a scenario in which no service and no part of the region will escape the impacts of the cuts that we would have to make if we aren't able to identify the funding. So I mentioned 40% cuts. What does that mean? For the northwest part of the region here, even high-performing lines like UP Northwest would probably only be able to run trains an hour at most, and I know there's already issues with frequency as we get up into McHenry County. But it would drive significant traffic, obviously, to the highways. And so for anyone who is in the region, whether they use the system or not, they're going to confront some impacts based on these cuts. As Dr. Sagar mentioned, once you remove service, it's incredibly hard to build that service back up. So even a short delay, if the General Assembly were to say, hey, we need another year to talk about that, it's a very complicated process to take things off the table, and it's very complicated to get things back on the table from a planning perspective. And in the meantime, people simply will find another way to move throughout the region. And it's just a process that we do not want to go through. Conversely, Metro, for example, has laid the groundwork for a regional rail plan that would sort of increase frequencies and, as I mentioned earlier, sort of eliminate that sort of schedule anxiety. If we can get 50% increases in service on weekdays and close some of those gaps where we might have scheduling gaps over the weekends or in the evenings, for example, it becomes a much more useful service for everyone that has access to it. Implementing these shorter headways really is what we think riders have asked us to try and focus on, which is frequency and reliability. There's a lot of conversations oftentimes, particularly in areas that don't have the frequency that everyone would like, about calibrating schedules. And really, as I mentioned before, frequency is the key to unlocking all that. It's not so much focusing on how do we calibrate these fine connections over dozens and dozens of miles, particularly in the Collier County portion of the region. The answer is, life happens, traffic happens, conflicts happen, but if you're only running a bus every once an hour, those problems really get extrapolated and really have adverse impacts. When if you could start running things every 45 minutes, every half hour, it really removes a lot of those problems, even if you have the unexpected happen. So I know that sounds sort of intuitive, but it really is the struggle that we face, which is not having enough frequency to meet the demand, but also not having enough frequency to allow it to be sort of a planning option for people as they think about how to move around the region. PACE also faces some significant cuts if they are forced to confront the fiscal cliff. You know, I can get into some details, but let me just say, you know, we're talking about eliminations of whole categories of service, like weekend service completely in many parts of the region. The knock-on effects of that, as you may know, for services like paratransit services for the disabled, is when mainline services are not running, paratransit services are not required to be running. And so you have these knock-on effects where literally people are going to be trapped in their homes over the weekend if they are required or dependent on these services, because they simply won't be able to be provided the resources that we have. Again, conversely, PACE has undertaken its revision process, and I know that many in the room probably participated in that process, but there are two scenarios that PACE is looking at in particular, and we believe that probably the outcome of the revision process is going to be a combination of both. But there's sort of this notion of growing ridership and frequency versus covering more of the geography. We think both of those are going to be put into the mix, but both have positive impacts for the region if they're able to be implemented. I'll close with a quick legislative update, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I know I went through a fair amount pretty quickly. I was in Springfield yesterday, and I think we're kind of through I would say the end of the beginning, if that makes sense, although time is short. Obviously, the General Assembly is scheduled to adjourn at the end of May. And we really do need to have some funding certainty at that timetable, or on that timetable, because our budgeting process, we're on a calendar year budget, really begins right as May concludes and June begins. We provide the service boards with what are called revenue marks, which is basically, hey, this is the amount of resources you're going to have available to provide service in the coming year. They go back and then conduct service planning for the upcoming calendar year, and then in the fall we sort of go back and forth on that process of approving budgets and service standards. If we do not have a solution identified on how to close that fiscal gap and prevent us from going over that cliff, if I can mix metaphors, we have to begin planning for service cuts. And that process is pretty prescribed. It's defined by the federal government. We have to seek their approval on it. There's a whole host of criteria that are used to determine whether the cuts are being implemented in an equitable manner. It's actually governed under the Federal Civil Rights Act in part, and that's a terrible process. I'll just be blunt. Our friends in Philadelphia had to go through that process because their General Assembly did not come up with some funding, and they are making some incredibly tough decisions about elimination of service in the greater Philadelphia area. We do not want to go through that process, and so we really do stress the urgency of taking action before the end of the General Assembly's spring session on May 31st. Both the House and the Senate have conducted, I would sort of say, general subject matter hearings. Other stakeholders in this process have introduced legislation, as I'm sure you're aware. The Metropolitan Mobility Authority Act was introduced last spring and is still sort of, I guess, viable in the General Assembly, and I think the headline coming out of that proposal was full consolidation of all the systems. I don't want to say anything is dead in Springfield, but I think the notion of sort of that type of change has probably moved on a little bit in terms of the debate, and now we're sort of talking about what reforms need to be implemented in the system to give everyone comfort that additional investment is warranted and how that money would be used to improve service for riders. I'm happy to talk about any of the sort of upcoming milestones of the legislative session. There is, I don't believe it's been scheduled, but there should be soon a hearing in the Senate Transportation Committee next week that would, I think, sort of conclude this discussion of sort of general parameters, and then I do believe we'll get into, and we really have to because the clock is ticking, get into the details on how a package of reforms and funding might come together. I'm happy, as I mentioned, to answer any questions, and we will have additional information coming out tomorrow from our board meeting, and we'll make sure that we distribute that to everyone. But we really do thank McHenry County in particular for their participation in this entire process. the county and municipalities within the county have been very thoughtful in their approach on how to improve the system and have been very, very active. I will just note that I've seen Dr. Sauger and others from Henry County and Springfield just about every time I've been down there, and I think that's been very helpful, particularly in these conversations about how the collar counties have a key priority in maintaining their access to the decision-making process in the region. And I'll just tell you that I think has gone a long way to sort of moving us beyond that consolidation conversation. So I wanted to thank you for your participation at that level. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions about our reforms or things going on.
Dr. Sager?
I want to try to keep my comments brief, however, I need to cover quite a bit here, so if you will excuse me for that and give me some leeway. First, I want to thank certainly Rob for being with us today to give a broad overview in terms of where we are and the need for us to move forward in this larger statewide discussion. I'm going to make some comments, and I kind of expect all of you around the table to kind of nod your head as I make some of these comments, because I think that there are some bits of factual information that we need to kind of keep in mind. The first is McHenry County currently is a net donor into the transit system relative to the service that is provided. Our service comes from Metra, our service comes from PACE. And we all know that it is a limited amount of service from Metra and from PACE over the last few years. Scott in particular has worked hard with this committee, other committees, and the county board to assist us in providing enhanced services to our local people as we respond to the needs internally. We've added the McBride program, as we're very familiar. We also have this most latest effort to provide individuals Uber service, if you will, to kind of move them forward at a very, very reasonable rate. The county picking up those costs and charging our residents a very small fee to get to where they need to go in terms of medical assistance, in terms of legal meetings or assistance, in terms of food, shopping, all of the basic things that we think are important to quality of life. So we have done that. Why? Because we have been underserviced. And that's a message that I try to communicate as I go to the RTA board meetings or to other areas. But it is important to acknowledge that we are at a critical stage. And if we expect increased services in the transit system for Northeast Illinois, for McHenry County, and for our residents, then we need to be actively engaged in this current process. I want to express unbelievable gratitude and kudos to Scott. He has done a remarkable job of being the voice for McHenry County at meetings. There's been a Senate committee meeting that Scott worked not only to put the script together or to outline very specifically the points that McHenry County considers, but he also presented that and did a remarkable job in terms of presentation. I will say to you that the words that Rob just said is absolutely true. McHenry County has been working and speaking with one voice. We've done a good job at promoting and lobbying across the board. And in fact, to the point that I've had representatives from RTA, I've had legislative individuals say that McHenry County's got the act together and we're working hard, we're here, and the voice of Scott in that meeting has been very, very positive. There was also a House committee meeting just yesterday that I was able to listen to, not be down there. I'm sure Rob was down there and in the midst of that meeting. But this is moving fast. It's moving fast because it has to move fast. But there are some things that I'm going to talk about a little bit more politically than Rob wants to talk about. First off, we all want, everyone knows that we want access to safe, reliable, clean transit service. Everybody wants that. But honestly, for us, that's not enough to kind of move us into action. What is important to move us into action is that this is an economic development question. We all talk about the improvements to our state highways and to other transportation areas. We focus on that a lot. We commit a lot of dollars to that. But transit is another element of that. We are fortunate to be on the Metro line. We need to ensure that we get the service that we have a right to receive to provide us for economic growth and development. And that is huge in terms of the planning of all of the entities that are on the line in terms of municipalities, but we also service the larger rural area as well. So economic development is truly important. Putting that aside, the politics. The politics of it right now are that there are 3 primary units in the RTA board and 3 primary units that determine the future of service. That is, obviously, the City of Chicago, because they have a large representation on the RTA board, as well as other agency boards. Suburban representatives, suburban Cook County representatives, and then the collar counties, right? So what are we speaking? Before I came to this committee, as well as law and government and other committees, and said, you know, we want to make sure that we have proper representation across the board, but we also want to have a quote-unquote supermajority vote. I've come off of that position, and now I'm speaking that what we want is balanced representation with a balanced voice. Why am I saying that? Because supermajority implies a supermajority, as we know it on the county board. But the fact is that there's lots of ways to derive balanced representation and voice. For example, you can dictate that there is at least 2 votes from the collar counties that go to make up a primary decision, right? Or you can say that you have to have 5 from the Cook County and Chicagoland, but another 5 from the collar counties. You can specify how that representation of voice is going to be made. That's where I believe that we are right now. Supermajority has become an ugly word, and it's not one around which we're going to get consensus. So I want us all to talk about balanced representation and balanced voice between those 3 entities. In Springfield right now, they are talking about governance first, because they expect a degree, and understandably so, of reform in governance if they are going to put forth a lot more resource financially. And so that seems to be what they're focusing on first, and then the money will be second. I'll come back to the money, but first it is this governance element. And right now, as Rob just said, we have the MMA or the CMAP presentation in the PART report, which was everybody coming together, all the service agencies coming together, forming one big unit. That still is being presented. That was the voice yesterday in the House committee hearing. But I think that that is losing steam. They have turned to the approach, if you will, of pointing fingers and talking inappropriately about RTA. They're starting to say, well, you didn't do this and you didn't do that. Anytime people turn to that type of approach, you know they're kind of in trouble because they're not taking a constructive approach. The larger constructive approach is what we have been taking, and I think that voice is coming strongly. I think, quite honestly, as Rob said, the decision is basically made by legislators. That's a hard thing to say. I shouldn't say that. But I think because of the logical, constructive voice that's out there, we're going to be able to retain the 3 service agencies, PACE, board, the Metro board and the CTA board. And I think that we're going to be able to have the RTA with larger amount of authority. They keep saying, well, RTA had authority to get things done before, so why did they do it? False. It's not false, but that's not true. It's false. And it's a false narrative. It's a myth. RTA didn't have the authority before, but I believe that they will have the authority as we begin to move forward. What are those authorities going to be? As Rob kind of indicated, I think we'll have the authority in planning in terms of financial oversight, financial planning, prioritization in terms of financial spending on an operational basis, and capital program priority determination, which is huge and is going to be probably the most significant element that affects us in McHenry County. Because right now, you look at, Rob, you can not be happy with me, but you look at the listing of capital improvements that are made on an annual basis, McHenry County is barely there, if at all. And so we need to get back some of that opportunity to see benefits for capital improvements in McHenry County, not the least of which is the Metro Rail Yard, very important out northwest of Woodside. All right, so governance, I think, is starting to gel, and then we're going to be able to put that aside, and it's going to turn to revenue. It is complex because there are bills out there right now as well to support a pilot program in user fees on highways. And so what does that mean? It's very complex, basically, but you know, everybody would be charged based upon the miles that you travel, getting away from the motor fuel tax, because the motor fuel tax is a problem with electric vehicles, right? So we're kind of decreasing motor fuel tax returns, and so highway usage tax, and that's a large discussion down in Springfield right now as well, is a pilot program there. Other states have implemented this. It seems to be effective to get away from the motor fuel tax and move to a usage fee. However, they're also talking about other things. Increased RTA sales tax, which we already pay, but increasing that tax to pay for some revenue. Increasing the tollway fees, so we have a disincentive to ride the tollways and move to the transit systems, right? A congestion tax or fee into Chicago, and certainly larger fare box fees across the board. And I'm going to speak here, you know, we support RTA, their fee, or CTA. CTA fees have been like $1.50, you know, to access the rail system. $1.50. And we need to increase those up to, I think, $2.50. That's not where it's going to go, but I think we need to increase fares along those lines. So there's a lot of conversation yet to be held. We're working on these things. Tomorrow, as Rob indicated, our meeting is going to be, what if we don't get it? What if we don't get the financial support? Where do we begin to make cuts? We have to plan for that. And then the other thing is, if we do get the successful, even if we don't get the successful financial support that we need from the legislature, what are we going to do with it? Well, we all know that we need to be expanding services and expanding capital investment and infrastructure investment if we're going to really have a modern system as we deserve here in Chicago area. So that's kind of where we are. I apologize for the long dialogue, but we need to be engaged, and I'm glad to thank Scott for providing leadership in that regard, and thanks to Rob and to everything that's going on with Rob's efforts and others in Springfield. So thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Mike?
So what is the, dollar-wise, what is the current ask?
So the budget gap that we're confronting is approximately $771 million. That essentially represents what the
the bucket, so to speak, that the federal government has filled with its relief programming, all approved in the wake of the pandemic. And so that sort of gets us whole. So if you look at that situation, 771 sort of maintains the status quo, and sort of maintains the momentum we've seen on ridership growth and expansion of services that has sort of been implemented as we've come out of the pandemic. CMAP, as Dr. Sager mentioned, and others who have studied the issue have pegged sort of a goal of 1.5 billion on an annual basis to implement the system, so to speak, that we would want, which is increased frequencies, greater hours of operations, and other programs that would enhance the system for riders. So, like a lot of things in the General Assembly, there's obviously a lot of room between 771 and 1.5 billion. But it's just an important principle, I think, to note that filling the gap essentially maintains what we have. If we want to improve the system and expand the system, we have to go beyond that. But essentially, those are the sort of bookends of the conversation: is the 771, which is the budget gap that will be required to close, and then that $1.5 billion aspirational goal to implement some of the service improvements that we talked about.
So,
I-
go ahead.
I think we all understand that, Illinois has financial difficulties, right? We're all very much aware of that. But it's really important to understand that out of the 23 major metropolitan areas that have transit systems in the United States, 23 major metro transit systems, Illinois is the lowest, the 23rd, the lowest in terms of state funding for transit services. The lowest. And we have one of the most efficient, one of the largest systems. I think we have the second largest, is that right? A transit system in the United States, and yet we get the lowest level of state funding. It's remarkable that we've been able to continue the services to the extent, to the efficiency we have at that level of funding. The state needs to fund transit at a higher level.
Yeah, and just one quick note on that. The state does, and we certainly believe that, especially when it comes to some mandated programs that they require us to offer, that they should be providing some significant more support in that area. But while those dollar figures are big, the way the system currently is funded, and I presume this would be a key part of the solution, is it's regionally funded. So those dollar amounts are big dollar amounts, but we're not asking for that to just be removed from the state budget. It is much more likely that the General Assembly will authorize the RTA to impose revenue increases on the 6 counties in northeastern Illinois that have access to the system. And so it's not necessarily a blank check, so to speak, from the state of Illinois. It's both, we hope, direct participation from the state of Illinois, and they can do things to not harm us as well that would have positive impacts, like eliminating the surcharge and the sales tax collection, for example. But it's also going to be a revenue generated from the region, separated from the state budget.
So, one of the previous presentations showed that there are still COVID dollars in the system. So is the 771, I'm assuming that is taking into account some of the COVID dollars, so that would be year 1, keep status quo year 2, year 3, where does that number go?
So we're on a calendar budget year, right? So we have to pass, we'll approve our budgets and before December, call it, of this year for 26. The service boards will exhaust their federal relief dollars, all of them within calendar year 26. And each of the independent service boards sort of hit that wall at a different point. But left unaddressed, that gap grows over time. So if you look at the outlying years, and I'm not looking too far down the road, but the next 2 to 4 years, that quickly pushes up against the $1 billion gap. So the system has been underfunded. We peg a lot of things to the pandemic, but if we really wanted to be truthful about it, and you look at sort of state funding trends and other challenges the system has faced, it's really been a 2-decade challenge that we faced. The great financial crisis really imposed much more hardship on the system than even COVID. It just wasn't as intense or as short term. So that gap will grow if we don't identify ways to close it. And really, you know, I don't want to get into the philosophy of it, but the state of Illinois has been a laggard in the sense that it's the revenue sources for the transit system are, you know, primarily the sales tax in the region, and our economy is moving away from, you know, tax, you know, economic activity generated from the sale and purchase of goods. But that's the only, you know, sort of area that we have revenue options identified from the state of Illinois for us. So that arresting that trend, which is, you know, trying to tax a shrinking part of the economy, is kind of the conversation that we have to have in Springfield, which is how do we identify stable, diverse funding that hopefully will grow over time so that we don't confront this system or this challenge on an ongoing basis. I know people, I just will say this about the transit system. It is very efficient in the sense of how much money it costs to move people around the system, and when you compare us to other systems. We don't, you know, this isn't a frequent conversation that we have. We had a conversation in 2007, and that really was the last time the state has been engaged in a transit funding conversation. And so we said the same things back then, and we hope we have a better outcome this time. But you know, that gap is a challenge, and it will grow if we don't sort of diversify the funding base that the system gets to operate.
So I didn't quite hear an exact answer, but what I kind of heard was 771 in 26, increasing up to $1 billion.
At 28.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So
It keeps the trains running.
Huh?
That just keeps the trains running.
Yeah, right, exactly, status quo, right. So is something indexed for, I know you talked about different ways in which that revenue stream would be growing in order to kind of, in essence, indexing it forward so that you don't continue to have this problem 5 years, 10 years down the road, right? I guess what I'm looking for is some thought process on, I think over time, there's also efficiencies in some of the programs that would hopefully be implemented to make life easier for the riding public, right? And so is that being equated into dollars and cents as you move along? Like, you know, some of these programs you first implement, they don't save tons of money right up front because they're a new program that you have to build, right? So you build it, it costs money to build it,
Yeah.
and then you start reaping those benefits years out, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to think how far back to go. Just like roadway transportation, there's no scenario in which there's not going to be public funding for the system, right? It's not a profit-making venture. It's a public service that we provide, and it's going to need public support for it beyond the fares. There are things that will reduce costs over time, like electrification of the system is expected to reap significant operation benefits once fully implemented. But the cost to get there obviously is significant. So yes, there are ways that the system can operate more efficiently, but there's also, I think McHenry County is a good example. The system, for example, the General Assembly has imposed a recovery ratio on the system, right? 50% of the operating funding of the system is supposed to come from fare boxes, from fares being paid. The sort of disincentive that requirement imposes on the region is that expansions of the system are very hard to do, because if you can't meet that 50% recovery ratio, you double down on the service that is producing those types of returns. So Huntley is a great example, right? Huntley has made investments in the infrastructure in their community in anticipation of one day hopefully having metro service in the area. But that service is hard to justify in a given scenario with the recovery ratio. So those are the types of things that we think we can make changes to that allow us to expand the system, that allow us to increase ridership, that hopefully create more efficiencies. But there's money that is needed at the upfront to implement that. I'm not sure if I'm getting to your exact question, but
No, that conceptually, that's kind of what I'm,
Yeah.
you know, to me, even at the county level, we're willing to invest into, I'll call it infrastructure, so that we can ultimately save money, you know? So if it costs us $1 million to build a salt dome in Algonquin, ultimately that's gonna save on fuel costs, it's gonna save on personnel costs, I mean, you know, so it's spending those dollars to ultimately be more efficient going forward. And that's, you know, I guess, so when you're looking at what's that need moving forward, hopefully some of these things you implement will then save dollars going down the line.
Yeah, and I think some of the reforms that we put forth, is particularly as it comes to like, you know, we call it regional fare policy, but it's not just setting regional fare policy, it's removing control over the technology that every rider uses, you know, the apps, to the regional entity, so that we can reduce time and friction and costs to implement changes. So when we make fare changes, because, and this is no fault of the CTA, it's just how the system evolved, the contract for the Ventra app is held at the CTA, and the other two providers have to sort of piggyback on that. We are supposed to be the financial oversight agency. Fares are the largest source of revenue that we generate on the system, right? So centralizing that from a regional perspective is hard to like define a dollar amount in the short term, but it dramatically reduces legal friction, conversations between the three, because we are already at the back end of it and can make and implement those changes without having to sort of go through a less efficient approach, you know, with one, it's sort of the tail wagging the dog in that scenario. So yeah, we believe our reforms are not just reforms that we, you know, kind of pulled off the shelf because we think these are things that will improve the system, although they are those things as well. We also think they will produce some savings over time, which is why it's primarily focused on how to improve the experience for riders, but it is an effort to try and wring some additional efficiencies out of the system.
And one last question, somewhat loaded, but, so let's just assume the state legislature looks at 771, between that and 1.5, and comes up with a number, 1 billion. How does that get divvied up? Because under current system, it's a formula.
Yeah, so there's two formulas, and I suspect there would be a third. I mean, and that's kind of how the General Assembly would operate, but I'll tell you how we approach it. We're very creative, but there are two main columns of funding, Sales Tax 1 and Sales Tax 2. Sales Tax 1 was passed in 1983, and there is a formula distribution associated with those dollars. Those dollars are primarily geographically based. I know some people don't understand that, but for example, if there's a transaction in McHenry County that's subject to the RTA sales tax, 85 cents of that dollar in tax stays with Metro and Pace, and none of it goes to the CTA. Conversely, if that transaction were to happen in the city of Chicago, it stays with the CTA. So there is a geographic basis to the main line of funding. Sales Tax 2, different set of priorities that were passed in 2008. Suburban bus is actually an ADA paratransit at the top of that list, and then yes, there's another formula that distributes money for the 3 service boards included in that piece of legislation. Our argument is once you get beyond the cliff, so if you close the cliff, it's likely those dollars will be distributed as they are today. But if you are making additional investments beyond the cliff, we would argue that it should be distributed based on what we would call the service standards model. And the real shorthand of that is, we already tell the service boards, here's the pile of revenue that you have to deal with this year, come back with a budget. In the reform scenario that we're putting forth, we would say, you also need to come back to us with a service standard, what types and levels of service is going to be available in your jurisdiction, so that everyone understands what's being committed to, what's being promised to be delivered. And then on a quarterly basis, we'd say, okay, you said you would deliver 100 units of transit, looks like you only provided 85, and so A, we want to mitigate that. What happened? How do we make sure you're delivering everything that you committed to? But we can base funding on what you actually delivered. And so in our mind, one of the reforms, again, has a financial impact. You set service standards and then you measure the service boards against the standard and then funding is connected to the delivery on those commitments. So that's how we would suggest money gets distributed. I think that's a conversation though that has yet to happen in Springfield. There would be a lot of conversation about how new dollars would be distributed, as we've always had, as we have revisited this issue over the years. But we think it should be connected to service. Essentially, you get paid for what you deliver, is how we would approach it.
So that's probably somewhat unpopular because everyone has a problem with the formulas already, so.
Well, I mean,
It's probably more fair,
Yeah.
and it's holding people accountable, not people, but, agencies
Services, yeah.
accountable, right? So I think that's a sellable point, but I don't know that you're gonna get a lot of agreement on the boards themselves about that thought process.
yeah, I mean, there's of course gonna be debate, and I think each of the service boards probably should make the case that they deserve more, right? Like, let me just say this, we're operating in an underfunded environment, and all of the service boards individually could make a very strong case that they deserve additional resources. We're not arguing that. But yes, that is going to be the crux of the debate. A, how much money, and then B, how's the money getting distributed? So, currently, about 50% of operating expenses flow to the CTA. And the CTA would say that's not enough, right? So there's just gonna be a debate over how that money gets distributed. But we believe it's better to tie that conversation to a measurable outcome, which is what service has been delivered, as opposed to a static formula that doesn't react to what's happening on the street.
Carl?
Mr. Sager, you had mentioned a couple of things that are really concerning, and I hope we're having pushback down at the state. One, you said move away from the gas tax because of EVs. Well, we all know that they're not going to be that popular, especially when we have battery plants. 3 years, millions to build, and they're out of business. And plus, they pay a heavy toll to have a license. And then you mentioned about watching where we go. What you would describe is, okay, Illinois, let's have more people leave the state because a lot of us don't like government knowing what we're doing. So please tell me that there is pushback from them bad ideas.
Oh yeah, there's lots of discussion in Springfield about the road usage tax. I mean, that's huge. The idea is that, and Rob, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the idea is that there would be a reporting structure for, and right now it's being presented as a pilot program of 1,000 vehicles.
1,000
Well,
volunteers.
we all know where that,
1,000 volunteers.
Right.
but we all know where that eventually goes, once they get a hand on, and it keeps on
Well,
snowballing.
We don't know that, but one of
Experience
the
has told us
things
that.
that they're talking about is the fact that, okay, you report the mileage, and there's discussion about a variety of ways of reporting that, whether that's self-reported or otherwise. And it has nothing to do with where you're going. It doesn't report any of the details, but it just talks about mileage. So you're going to pay a tax for that mileage. You also have to fill up your gas tank, so you're paying a motor fuel tax over here. So that would be credited against what this usage would be. So you're going to have just a net differential there that exists one way or the other. Either you get credit because of the motor fuel tax that you have already paid, or you have to pay additional because you've driven more than that tax. So
It's not really a solution to any of the problems presented right now, but it's an element that the labor bill puts out there because we do have a longer-term problem of how we're funding transportation.
Agreed.
Relying on motor fuel tax. So we're trying to think about that.
And on
The
the
experience has shown us, once they get their little foot in there,
Yeah, I mean, we can.
it cascades.
Yeah.
And then to force us, we want you to be in a bus, driving with the bus and not your car. We're Americans, we love our autos. And that is going to be forcing more to go. I mean,
We're never gonna get away, in my mind, from the gas pump. I just don't think that that's going to happen myself. But we are gonna see an increase. So we will see a decline in the gas pump tax because more electric vehicles are gonna come out. Again, will it ever go away? No. But here's, how do you balance those two things? How do you seek revenue? And as Peter said, there's an opportunity to seek revenue with the usage tax. So it's out there. It's a long discussion. This discussion has been going on, Rob, for, I don't know, at least 20 years.
Very much. I just want to clarify, the road usage charge is not an initiative of the RTA. It is something that the labor bill has put forth as a pilot program, as was discussed.
It's a small piece of this.
Yeah,
Very small piece.
I'll tell you, it gets most of the conversation because it is, intriguing in a good and a bad way, I guess, from people. It's not something that we necessarily put forth, but that is the argument that the motor fuel tax, obviously depends on people putting gas in their vehicle. I will just say, for the record, vehicle miles traveled in Illinois this year will be higher than last year. And then that's measured by gas taxes. So traffic is worse now than it was before the pandemic. More people are driving than they were back then. So it is a long-term issue. It is not a short-term issue. And in fact, the motor fuel tax, which funds capital construction for both transit and roads, is frankly flush. There's the real problem the state of Illinois is having is getting that money out the door as opposed to collecting it. So it's a longer conversation for the future, but I can't speak to it or defend it because it is something that the labor committee's decided to put forward. I think their concern is at some point it materially impacts how much money we have for road and transit construction. So they're trying to get ahead of it.
The point is that the legislature should be encouraged, and I think they will understand that we have to have a mix of sustainable revenue sources to be able to put and invest, that's the word, invest in the transit system. And so, usage tax is one of those, again, congestion tax perhaps, for Chicago is another one that's been talked about. There's a whole bunch of revenue sources that are being imagined, put it that way right now. Got a long way to get there because they all require state action, state legislation.
All right, I guess I'm gonna ask a couple of questions, and I'm not sure if I'm knowledgeable enough to ask these questions. So some of them could be really stupid questions. And with our state legislature and our governor, I'll try to be tactful here. How do you feel in your going downstate all the time? How do you feel the priority of this situation is on their minds? When they have a whole lot of priorities, self-serving priorities, not so much on transportation, some on political ideology. And so you've got 771 that you guys are talking, a number that you were hoping, right? What if you get 400? Wheels come off, right?
Yeah.
On every program that involves McHenry County.
There's no doubt if we are not able to close the gap, that service across the region will be impacted. And as I don't need to tell you, folks in McHenry County already are saying it's insufficient as it is, right? So it'll fall out there from the status quo, unfortunately. I think there's good attention being paid, and it is a priority, but it's also sort of an interesting dynamic in the sense that the state of Illinois created the RTA and gave it taxing authority to hopefully make it self-sufficient and prevent us from going back down into Springfield. It's literally why we were created, because there were a cascading series of crises as the system transitioned from private, corporations providing these services to public corporations. In fact, it was one of the main reasons why the state had a constitutional convention in the 70s, which was to address this issue and sort of regionalize it so it didn't have to go down to Springfield all the time. I do think, though, that the governor in particular has been focused on it, and he's been very clear in what his priorities are, and he's communicated them to our chairman directly, which is, I want to see reform, I want to see a new way of thinking on these things, and then, frankly, they're probably going to, if I had to bet, which is a terrible thing to do around the legislature, provide us authority and then require our board to make some decisions on what revenue it would like to see to generate, the funds needed. And so it'll be sort of an RTA decision. That was what happened in 2008. The General Assembly said, okay, the RTA has taxing authority, it's currently capped, we'll lift that cap, but it's up to the RTA board if they actually want to use that cap. I'm assuming something similar to that will happen this time around. But we are making the case that, as Dr. Sager mentioned, state funding, particularly for some key mandated programs, ADA paratransit and free and reduced rides, so the system is required to provide free rides or reduced rides for a variety of different populations. Those two programs together cost the system about $400 million a year. The state of Illinois gives us about $30 million for those two programs. And so my pitch to lawmakers in Springfield, and I do think there's some traction here, and the governor seems, again, to understand, but if we can come together on anything, it should be on rides for seniors and the disabled. Like, let's fund those programs, and frankly, that $400 million is inclusive in that 771. So fixing that problem is a huge part of the overall problem. But to get back to your point, if we don't get to that $771 amount, it just have to be very clear there are going to be meaningful cuts to service across the region.
Okay, and then the federal funds, the COVID funds in 26 are gone. What chance of any other federal, in today's environment, there's probably no chance for any additional federal, but is there an amount of federal besides COVID that we have a chance of losing?
So there's two things. The federal government for large systems, think New York, Boston, Philadelphia, us, LA, does not provide any operating funding at all.
None, okay.
And hasn't since the Reagan administration. They ironically provide rural and smaller systems operating funding directly. They don't provide the large systems with any funding. So the federal funding that there were some prospects and some discussions about sort of, look, we had this experience with COVID. It actually demonstrated that the system could improve. If you have some resources, maybe the federal government should stay in the operating game permanently. I think given the change in majorities in Congress and the administration, that's not going to happen. But the federal government does participate on the capital side, so funding for infrastructure and vehicles and sort of capital investments to a large degree. And frankly, that's very uncertain. Most of it is driven by formulas, essentially driven by population and need, and so the system here in Northeastern Illinois does fairly well in that formula system just because we're big, right? There's a lot of conversation that those formulas would be revisited, and that different factors may be included in those formulas, and so over the midterm, those things could change. Right now, we've not seen any sort of attempts to claw back any money that's been authorized, but I mentioned the transition to electric vehicles, and Kendra has done a lot of work at the RTA level and service board levels to identify this, but the ability of the system to transition to electric vehicles, electrification, is almost wholly dependent on the federal government's participation in that process, and I don't think, frankly, that those programs are a high priority for the DOT right now in DC.
Okay.
So that transition is going to be challenged.
Mr. Kunkel.
I think we will, some form or fashion, be grasping onto the edge of the cliff by our fingernails and get through this piece of this. And of course, increased taxation is going to be a part of that. Our problem is the same age-old problem we've had for a long, long time. Chicago is horribly mismanaged. The CTA debt and mismanagement of their portion, and they're still looking to suck us in their vortex to help with that problem. Without and I'm not making this political, but without the people of Illinois going to the ballot box and finding a governor and legislators who prioritize public transportation over, as you stated, some of these outlandish things that we waste money on. So that's efficiencies. I do believe there's some probably efficiencies in our public transit, but that's not enough, as we all know. That'll get us hanging by our fingernails. That's required that our governor, I mean, we can't even get a balanced budget in Illinois. Where do you come up with another $1.5 billion? And then Chicago too, horribly mismanaged, again, creating more debt for themselves. I think it's foolish to look at this and say this is this, that, and a management change, which is what they're really proposing here to solve this issue. If we want to survive in mass transit, public transit, beyond the fingernail grip of this cliff, it's going to take huge political change where these budgets are balanced and where these dollars are put back in service to the people instead of service to little pet projects. I know that's saying a lot, but we beat this a lot. This, as Mike was talking about, where do we go in year 3, 4, 5, and 6? That is going to be a political change, not an algorithm to make those dollars go farther. Because we all know you can't split this hair any finer than it is now. It means increased taxes, and those increased taxes will be on the collar counties. Chicago has no taxing base there anymore. They have no money anymore. In fact, we're getting some of their people. That's the facts. This is going to turn out to be a political issue if we want to survive down the road. Off my soapbox.
Okay. Then, Mike?
Maybe Brian, you should answer this versus Rob. I don't want to put Rob on the pressure cooker. But are you aware what happened at SEPTA? Why that whole thing transpired? Are you worried? Are you versed at all about the history of that?
I'm not sure what happened.
Well, why the legislature didn't fund SEPTA to the point where they wanted to?
Oh, there was political debates in the General Assembly, or in the legislature in Springfield, about how to fund statewide. I was just meant to say that those debates did not conclude, and so they were forced into making cuts, I guess.
Right. Okay. So one of the correlations there was, and the reason why I brought that up is because it kind of correlates to what's going on here. So back 6 months ago, the General Assembly was all about CTA's president and that whole situation. Well, now we have a new female acting president at CTA who, as a side note, is doing a great job. Comments that I've heard is her outreach to organizations and groups is more happened than he ever had happen in his whole tenure. So she's doing a great job, and I applaud her for stepping up. But without that rallying cry, because again, not to be political, but the General Assembly always looks for things that they can kind of, pin and say, well, if this solved this problem, and so that problem of the president is gone now. So I believe there's a general intent to try and solve this problem, but they always typically look for things that they can kind of use as a scapegoat to try and weasel out of, making hard decisions at times. And, we know that the governor's already said that budget-wise, it'll be one of the most difficult budgets that he's had to face since he's been governor. And so I think your comment about how pushing it off to RTA to make those decisions, hard decisions, is probably the realistic approach as to how, because the reality is they don't want to make those decisions. You know, it's a political body who represent political people who get elected, who have to retain their seats. So anything they can say, well, I didn't make that decision, RTA made that decision, or, you know, the governor made, or someone else made that decision but me, I wouldn't have done it that way, you know? That's classic line, right? So I think it's a situation where, is there anything in Springfield right now that you see the General Assembly is saying, well, only if you do this, meaning like get rid of the president or, you know, whatever, that is kind of the crux of how they're trying to sidestep the hard decisions, I guess.
I mean, I can tell you what I think.
And again, maybe you shouldn't answer that, I don't.
Well, I'm not gonna answer the second part.
Okay.
I think I can tell you what people have sort of identified as what the antes are, right? Like the things that need to happen as a prerequisite to any of it. And it really is, we're not unique in identifying the 3 areas that we're talking about for reform. CMAP has done them, and other folks have talked about shifting some of these big bucket items to the regional entities. So affairs and interest policy, service standards, and capital project prioritization. I think everyone sort of agrees those are important things to get centralized. And when I say everyone agrees, I don't mean in a roll call sense, but I think that the conversation's been sort of focused on. I don't know what sort of other political, you know, prices that people are going to put on things. You know, consolidation I think was one of those things. They thought that was a big dramatic move and would represent some significant change. I think, thankfully, from participation like folks up here, they've been sort of educated on the implications of that. So there could be something else. Renaming of entities. I think the labor bill has suggested changing how certain appointments are made to the boards and who makes those appointments. So I think there will be changes like that, in addition to the sort of what we would call the policy things that we would suggest need to happen.
Yeah, I agree. I think they feel that there's a demand for some reform, right? And they want to have some reform, but they want to be able to pridefully say, okay, we heard the fact that we needed some changes, so we've made some changes. And I think the reform is going to be an RTA, whether it's called RTA, whether it's called MMA, or the Mickey Mouse Club is irrelevant. You know, it's going to be a change, and we're going to have Collier County representation, we're going to have suburban representation in suburban Cook County, we're going to have municipal or city representation, and I think likely we'll have some governor participation with maybe some specificity of appointment. So the governor's office might appoint somebody from labor or from business or from user groups or whatever it might be. But I think that that's going to ultimately be the balance, if you will, of representation, and they're going to call that reform. And so there's a greater voice, there's a greater opportunity of participation, and so they're going to call that reform. I think we should accept that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's a good thing to be doing. And then I think, as Rob has indicated very appropriately, I think they're going to look to that body, as it's been reformed, to now address some of the revenue issues and come up with a set of plans that will meet those needs. This is a long-term process. I mean, if we get $771 million to fill that gap this year, and this is Brian Sagers talking, nobody else, but I think it's going to be absolutely remarkable. Absolutely remarkable if that happens. I hope it does. I'm not sure it will. I think it's more likely that if we get support for senior programs, if we get support for ADA, which truly has been imposed anyway, in a way, it's a good service, but it has been imposed upon us, and they assume some responsibility for that, that's going to be a positive thing. But we'll see, right?
Okay.
Thanks to Rob very much. Kendra, thanks for being here today. We're grateful for that. We look forward to seeing you at the board meeting tomorrow. If you stick around for a little bit longer, I'll have a conversation with you. I want to again say thanks to Scott, just a yeoman's job in putting things forward for McHenry County on our behalf. So.
Thank you.
Well, thank you,
Thanks, Scott,
Rob.
too. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob.
All right, let's move down to 6.2B, which is MC.
I promise I'll be quick, and before I start, I just want to say, it's not just Scott doing a lot of this work, I got a good team behind the scenes that helps me, both here at DOT, but also with Dean's office, so there's a lot of credit to go around, so thank you, but it's not just me. I'll be quick. Before I get into the request that is in your packet from the health department, I just wanted to kind of update everybody on how is MC Ride Connect working. This is our Uber subsidy program. So what I have here on the slide is just showing what the county's cost per trip since we started MC Ride Connect back in August. Again, this is the county's portion. So on MC Ride, we cover half the trip cost. On MC Ride, PACE covers the other half. So really, it's a $40 trip, and the county, on average, covers about $20 of that $40 trip. On Connect, just to remind everyone, we've committed to subsidizing up to $16 on people's Uber rides for certain individuals. On average, we've been coming in at around $13 per trip, because some people obviously don't take a long trip, they take a very short trip that requires less subsidy. On average, the Connect trips are a little bit longer than the MC Ride, Dial Ride trips are. That's partially a product of the fact that we take people around the entire Chicagoland area. So we got some trips that skew this number quite dramatically on the upper end, but most of our trips are still just within McHenry County. So that's just kind of setting the stage for, some of the decisions I want you all to make a little later. This just gets more into detail. You don't need to kind of read all of this. The main takeaway is most people, every dot here on the lower right is an individual. In the month of January, you'll see most people are taking MC Ride Connect, anywhere from a dozen times, a couple dozen. We've got some 3 or 4 people that are using it quite a lot, 60, 70, even 80 times a month. These people that are using it to get to work, to and from work every day, plus a little bit on the weekends. So that you can see how that would add up pretty quickly. But again, this is just kind of going over what we've seen so far. Over the 5.5-month period we've been operating, so mid-August through January on the screen, we've spent about $63,000 in county subsidy over that 5.5-month period. That gave us about 4,800 subsidized trips, and of that, about $7,300 was just admin fees to Uber. So every time we give a trip, there's a $1.50 administrative fee that we pay Uber for that trip. Regardless of whether that was a $16 subsidy or a $2 subsidy, we pay Uber $1.50 per trip. We're continuing to see slow and steady growth in registered riders too. So it's taking a lot of time for people to sort of get through the process of registering, but the number of riders that we can register continues to go up every month. So key takeaways, we've got about 214 individuals that are fully registered in the program as of this week. The Uber subsidy program, Connect, is less expensive on a cost per trip, which is what we expected, right, than the Dial-A-Ride program. Again, it's about a $40 trip on Dial-A-Ride compared to about a $13 subsidy on Connect. It's also providing longer distance trips. Disregard this 7-7, that was a mistake on my end. Just a reminder, you all approved an appropriation of $420,000 for FY25. We're on track to only spend about $150,000 to $200,000 of that. So less than half of what you've already appropriated, we expect we're going to spend if trends continue on the program as it is today. So what that means is that we do have capacity to expand this program for the remainder of this year and then even into next year. What you'll see in your packet was a request by the health department to add WIC clients. There are conversations going on behind the scenes also with specialty courts. You'll recall we, DOT, fund specialty courts, their transportation program, to the tune of, I think, $60,000 a year we give them for basically a bus program. And potentially, this could be a better solution for those clients as well, a more cost-effective solution if we decided to go down that road. I've also been talking with Leo at Mental Health about how we serve some of the mental health board clients as well, potentially using this service. The last slide, just because you might ask, okay, if we had WIC clients, which we estimate about 12,000 individuals currently in McHenry County are qualified for WIC. How is that going to impact our service if you said yes to that request? Well, currently today, we have about 65,000 residents that are eligible to use MC Ride Connect today. So 1 in 5, a little over 1 in 5 people can use this program today, including a lot of people in this room. The 12,000 WIC clients, we would estimate, would only add about 40 new users to Connect, or about $26,000 a year. So in terms of scale of what this would cost us if we decided to say yes, it's a very small additional cost. Again, these are just estimates, but these are the best estimates we have today. So with that, I wanted to kind of throw it to this group. You all saw the letter we got from Ms. Adamson from the health department to add their clients. If there are any questions, I can help answer those today. But I do want to have a conversation not just about WIC, but potentially other groups to expand this program into as well. So I'll kind of leave it there.
If you were to bring the court in, the court one, would that replace the 60,000 or would that?
If I got direction from this group to expand, to add specialty courts users into this program, the idea would be we would spend money there instead of where we're spending money today.
Okay.
The program as exists has been well underutilized on the courts
Yes.
programming. This, I think, given the flexibility it affords, would be better used
100%.
and cheaper.
Much cheaper.
Matt?
On that same line, I believe that these numbers are askew, because I do believe the specialty courts people use it, not specifically, they're mostly younger, that know how to use this Uber feature and how to use this thing,
Yeah.
and how to register. Also, I believe those WIC numbers would be much larger than that 40,
Yeah.
because there again, you're dealing with the youth, and they are much more savvy with that program, but it is the cheaper of the two programs. My vote, my wish would be absolutely taking the courts people, because we're already subsidizing that, helps us budget-wise, but at least for 2025, to not take on any more while we ride out this pilot program. Otherwise, we're messing up our matrix of how this actually works, to my mind. Certainly, we could keep adding all this up until we get all my uncles and relatives, but then do we really learn anything at this one-year adventure that we're doing?
You're 65 next year, is that what you're saying?
Not yet. I have a few more hills to climb. But anyway, that would be my vote. I would not mind adding the courts, because we're already subsidizing the courts now. And I do think we'd get better ridership with the court. It would also be another matrix to look at and say, okay, here's a younger pool of people. What percentage of those come over? And if we do pick up WIC, maybe we do the courts first and then WIC second.
And the reason, again, WIC came first. They were the first ones to ask us. Specialty courts has not asked us to transition over. I've not even really had that conversation with the courts yet. So even if we wanted to do that, that would still have to be a negotiation, I think, with the courts.
But we are supplementing them now.
We are, but I'm just letting everyone know, like, we have a request in front of us today, and we don't have a request from the courts yet. That could come in the future, but, yeah. And I totally understand on the estimates. These are simply estimates. It could be a lot, it could be double this, it could be triple this, I don't know.
The courts shouldn't have any problem if it's going to be cheaper, we're saving money. Like with Matt, keep the court people on, the rest off for right now. Let's get a good data after a year and see what it looks like.
I will say, we have a current agreement with the specialty courts. I think that goes through the end of this fiscal year.
You're right.
Yeah, yeah, so we would have to start over with a new agreement. That would take some time. And again, I'm not even sure if they would say yes. They may say, no, we like the program as it exists today. We're not
What would
interested
be
in
the change? You're still getting a person from here
Yeah.
to court
Well,
and back, and it's
so,
just
yeah.
the vehicle that they're going in. So why would they have a
Well,
problem?
for one example, so the specialty courts program as it exists today, it's a bus like our PACE buses that picks people up at designated stops. Those riders, those specialty courts riders, do not pay a fare. They get on the bus and they go to courts. Okay. This the rider pays the first $4 of the trip, both ways, right? So that is one reason why specialty courts might say we're not interested, because our riders, we feel like if they're paying a fare, they're just gonna say, screw it, we're not gonna use the transportation at all. So, not to put words in their mouth, but I think there's a lot of differences between what the court's program is today and what we would offer here that would need to be ironed out through negotiations with them.
Not to belabor this, but if you could do it 1 minute, you put up their mental health board also quickly. I mean, and it's a similar situation. Mental health has significant transportation budget getting their clients around. I think this could help reduce. I think there's obviously an interest in helping the mental health board reduce their costs, but it's not a blanket solution. It can provide help in some areas, but it's some of that issue too. They provide free rides now, and would they be free if we did it?
Yeah, no, and they could, that's the thing, they could be under our program as it exists today, it's a $4 fare. Every
So
time
what-
we give subsidy on Uber, the rider pays the first $4. And I will say something I didn't mention earlier. A lot of WIC clients are already taking our Dial-A-Ride program today, our bus program. So WIC, in order to be WIC qualified, you need to be a low-income individual that meets other criteria. But I don't have the number in front of me because we don't ask people that use our bus, are you WIC certified or not? But I guarantee that $40 a trip, there's a lot of WIC clients that are taking the bus and paying $40 a trip. I don't know how many, but there are some people that do that. If we offered this as an option, perhaps people would take a $13 ride instead of $40. So there would be some of that transition from a more expensive service to a cheaper service.
So what is your specific ask today?
My ask is, we have a request from the health department to add WIC clients to the eligibility criteria for this program, making them eligible for Uber subsidy. My ask of the committee is, do you want to add them to our program as eligible client types? In addition to what we already have, which is seniors over 65 or people with disabilities.
So we have to bring that forward next month as a resolution.
I don't think so.
No?
I think if I got direction from this committee, you've already appropriated the money. If you directed me to add them as a client type, I could work with PACE to add them into our agreement with PACE, and it wouldn't take necessarily an action from the board to do that. I can do that on my own. But I didn't feel like.
So we need a consensus if we're thinking about this and if people are comfortable with this.
I support it. I think it's an efficient way to do it. I think it's a cost saving ultimately.
Yeah, speak up, guys, and Gail.
The cost-saving portion is what I don't know, because if they're not using our services now, how do we know? And if we don't know what they're using our service, we can estimate it's a cost saving, but is it really a cost savings? And I was really interested in seeing how this would go and knew this would be slower for seniors. I'm not a senior yet, but I'm getting close. I mean, I've just mastered the iPhone. I do think this is something that will get legs and go higher, but I do think it takes time. I don't know how bringing someone else skews that data, and if we ever know at that point whether we're helping or hurting at that point.
Okay. No?
Sort of in Matt's camp. You know, let's take one, finish it out before we start peppering it with all outside elements.
But I would argue that staff has done a remarkable job of tracking this already. I mean, providing unbelievable data up here for us. And I think that they can distinguish that enough through data
That's a question
collection.
for Scott. Can you distinguish the difference between an ADA rider and a senior rider and a now a WIC rider?
Yeah, we would be able to. We'd be able to track that month by month. They would be coded in.
And what month are we in the program?
Well, I have data through the month of January, because we get data from PACE, and they're usually a couple months behind. So we have data through January, but service is being continued today, obviously. So service is getting continued nonstop, so.
And we have a budget, and that budget is finite, which is
Budget
fine.
is, right.
So-
And to assuage some concerns, I mean, we could phrase this as a WIC pilot program, right? This could be something that is just for a year or less and see how it works. And if it's not operating as you all feel like it should, we could discontinue it after that.
Yeah, because that would kind of be the fear, is if we all of a sudden run out of bucket before we run out of year, that's the fear. Having money left to put into the bucket next year would be great. Running out means we're finding a source to finish our
What would be interesting to me is how many of those $40 rides would move over to.
And that's-
That's
I
me
mean,
the
tracking
most
that.
intriguing part of
You're not
this.
tracking that, are you?
So what we don't, again, I don't ask, when people sign up for MC Ride and they use our dialer ride, I don't ask them, are they WIC certified? You know, that's not a question we ask
Yes.
people.
Understood.
We could, if we added WIC clients to the Connect program, we get a list of who's ridden that month. I could cross-reference the new Connect riders that are WIC clients with people that have used MC Ride in the past to see how many people have transitioned from one to the other. That is something I could do, but we would need data we would need to say yes and start operating this for them to get that information.
I would be in support of this so long as we had a finite term, just so that we don't run out of bucket, that's all.
Okay,
Yeah.
you're
What, quiet?
you're quiet,
Yeah.
unusual.
So they own.
Are you sick?
I spoke in the last time, I'm fine with this, I think we can, I think if you make it 6 months, then you got a half a year and a half a year, I think it is a savings ultimately, and again, if you're on WIC, you're one of our neediest people in the county anyways, and that's what this whole program's all about, so. And obviously, we're not spending what we budgeted, so not that I'm looking for ways to spend more money, but I'm also looking for ways to help the most neediest, so I don't have an issue with it.
It's a good time at the end of this quarter too to start. Get a break. Paul?
Would it just be the Uber that they're taking, or would they have access to?
They already have MC Ride access.
Everyone has access to MC Ride. All of us can use MC Ride today.
Okay.
And so there are some WIC clients that use MC Ride. We have over 3,500 people that use MC Ride on a yearly basis, right? Some of those have to be WIC clients. But yeah, so the answer is yes. And Joe mentioned to me, what would that if there was a finite term associated with this pilot program, what would that look like? We could make that the end of this fiscal year, end of November. Just know though, I'm not sure, I don't have an answer how long it's gonna take PACE to add WIC to this program. It might take 3 months or more to even start this for the WIC clients. So we might start adding them in September and say, you got 2 months to demonstrate your usefulness, and then is that enough time to really demonstrate the usefulness?
But unless you're gonna come back to us and ask for an increase in the budget line item, then that's a control right there, so I don't, I'm not that worried about that aspect, I guess.
Yeah, 2 months of data, and I do think younger people will be much quicker to get on this program. That would be data in itself, so.
Well, you could promote it while they were working on it.
Yeah, we could, and we would. We intentionally did a soft rollout of this program because we didn't want it to explode right away. But now we sort of know who's using it and that sort of demand, so we could do a big advertising push to sort of let people know it's coming.
Okay. Anybody else any input in this? Okay, I think you got your direction.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. Very transit heavy day, so I appreciate the input.
Okay. What else we got here? That's it. Got a back page to here this morning. Did I? We don't have something going on our state's attorney.
No, but quick update for staff report, since we had the conversation here of many of you using 47 to come in this morning. So Daryl's just got a quick update of what's coming for our Randall Road project.
Sure.
Yeah, and it'll be short. We are in the phase right now with the majority of the utility relocations. AT&T is one, that's something yet from earlier today. ComEd as well, Nicor Gas is just about done. So we're getting to the phase where end of this month, early next month, we're gonna be doing more of the heavy construction, kind of pre-stage work with some grading by the Lake in the Hills Bend, some storm sewer work, some pre-stage as they call it at this point. Heavy construction later this summer, once we get full utilities out of the way, Miller Road South. So it is in process. We're also planning a public meeting, an open house meeting, just to give neighborhoods and residents an opportunity to come see the construction schedule. We're looking at end of April, maybe early May. It could be, we haven't nailed down the venue. We are actually working more closely with Lake in the Hills and their village facility. We can't nail that down. We'll look to.
Hey, I heard there's a bank that's vacant right at the corner there.
Parking's a little small.
Yeah, that's true.
They are updated.
We don't own it anymore.
Yeah. And just touch on that one thing for Daryl also is, there is a project website, it will be updated. Therefore, if any of you are interested, go to it and sign up, and you'll get updates that come up on what's going on with the Randall Road project.
Only the state had that.
Okay, with that, is there a motion to adjourn? Mr. Kaminsky, moves, Mr. Kunkel seconds, all those in favor? Thank you all for attending. I know, that's what I said. They have it in the first